You think it's going to get worse? Do you think the Chinese are going to ratchet up pressure on the Western media even further?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's interesting. They haven't expelled everybody. In the last year, they have let in a few people. I think, like the New York Times, I think has 2 people now, whereas for a while it only had 1. None of the people who were expelled have been allowed back in or allowed to go to Hong Kong. But they have allowed a few new people in. You know, it's kind of a paradox. I mean, I think on the one hand, the Chinese leadership, you know, they want to see the international order reflect what they see as China's legitimate standing as this great power. On the other hand, they also sort of crave respect and legitimacy from the existing order and institution. So if you're a serious superpower, you need to have a New York Times correspondent there. Otherwise, you're not a serious superpower. So they want it, but they want to control it. And it doesn't cost them very much to have 1 or 2 people there because the dynamic, you know, the problems they create on the ground, the difficulties of getting around are such that, you know, they can sort of live with it. But the treatment of the press also is a barometer of the relationship. And if the relationship is going down, it's going to get harder for the press, there's no question.
It's amazing what Paul Mazur has been able to do from Seoul and Chris Buckley from Sydney.
Chris is now in Taipei, actually,
oh, really?
Which is the new center of China watching.
The new old center.
The new old center of China watching. I'm there too. So.
Well, this is a related question. Could it reach the situation that we had before 1979 and that there is no Western media, no American media on the... What you just said.
I don't think so. I think you know, the Chinese need to be able to say, what do you mean we're giving them trouble? There's a Washington Post correspondent, there's a New York Times correspondent, there are 3 Wall Street Journal correspondents. Bloomberg is reporting our, you know, flourishing stock markets. So they want that and they need that, and they've created a control mechanism where they can have it without generally the press creating the kind of problems, because it's no longer possible to do the things that were possible before. For example, in Assignment China, Kathy Chen, who was a Wall Street Journal reporter, talks about wanting to do a story on the great migration of people from the countryside to work in the big joint venture factories. So she went out to Sichuan and she got on a bus with these 5 young girls who were leaving their villages for the first time and going to Guangdong to work in a Mattel doll factory. And it was just her, there was no minders, just sat on this bus for 5 days and talked to these young women, and then she sneaked into their dormitory in Dongguan because she looked like them. She got a fantastic piece. That would effectively be almost impossible to do today. So the government can sort of have its cake and eat it too, if I'm not sure if that's the right metaphor. But it's,
I'm going to ask one more question, and I will take questions from the floor, or I'll keep talking forever if you wish. So imagine what would have happened if Chris Buckley had not been in Wuhan, Dake Kong, and others.
No.
We might never have known anything about where COVID came from.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the on-the-ground presence that allows us to have some chance of understanding the dynamics internally. So if in fact more and more reportings have to be done outside via satellites, it may become even more mysterious what's actually happening inside China.
I think it's very worrisome because not being able to put your pulse on the society in the way that comes from just traveling around, looking at things, talking to people, means that we don't really have a sense of the dynamic in the society. And because there isn't that kind of reporting, what does get in the news is wolf warrior diplomacy and TikTok hearings and war over Taiwan. And that's probably because it's legitimate news. I mean, it's happening, got to be reported. But it makes the sort of depiction of China into this sort of one-dimensional bad guy. Whereas the reality is it's a living, breathing society of 1.3 billion individuals who have their own hopes and dreams and successes and failures and aspirations, and whose feelings and activities will be important in shaping the future of China. And to not have a sense of that, I mean, we don't really know whether the bulk of the Chinese people like the direction it's going now or are unhappy. We sort of guess that the lockdowns in Shanghai may have antagonized the urban middle class who were previously quite happy to go along because as long as they did it to the Uyghurs but not to the urban middle class, that was fine. Will that have political consequences? Maybe, possibly. Do we have any sense of that because we're able to get around and talk to people? Not really. So we're kind of, operating in a void, which I think is dangerous on policy level and a disservice to consumers of news. And ironically, it hurts China too, because if the Chinese don't like the depiction of China as the evil empire 2.0, not allowing journalists to show that it's a living, breathing society full of ordinary human beings who don't spend all their time spouting wolf warrior slogans, hurts them too. But I think they feel, well, we can use social media and our own outlets to tell our story. We don't need them.
Yes, Alan Frank.
Mike, what's your assessment of the actual effect on U.S. relations with China by Trump's 4 years in office?
I think it was an absolutely profound shift, although it wasn't initiated by Trump. I think you can date the sort of beginnings of this shift to the Obama period. I think when there was a kind of somewhat unrealistic notion when Obama took office that we're going to have this great cooperative relationship with China. If you read some of the stuff that his main Asia guy, Jeff Bader, wrote, that's what he talked about. But after the financial crisis, as I mentioned, I think the Chinese thought the Americans are downward slope. And the first telltale sign of that came when Obama made his trip to China in 2009. And there's a section in the book where the reporters who were covering that trip talked about how the Chinese went out of their way. Were you in China? No. Went out of their way to humiliate him. You know, they wouldn't let him do a live press conference. They packed. They wouldn't let him speak where he wanted to speak. You know, they treated him like, oh, he's this young whippersnapper, and what does he know? And he's just a freshman, and so on. And there was this kind of contempt, and I think that resonated. And it's not a coincidence that after that, you saw the beginning of the so-called pivot to Asia and this more critical perception of China, although there really was an attempt still to try and make it work. But then, Trump came in and for all sorts of muddled, reasons did what he did. But the people around him who worked on China were very tough-minded, like Matt Pottinger, who some of you may know, I knew him when he was a Wall Street Journal correspondent in Beijing. And so I think they really shifted gears. But it's not unilateral, and some of the forces that are at work are China's own behavior. Because the Chinese, started building these man-made islands in the South China Sea with military use, and the Chinese were being very provocative around the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands with Japan. The Chinese were pushing it already. I think the way Trump did it, like everything else Trump did, was clumsy and crude and stupid and counterproductive and alienating allies when you need allies. And I think Biden has done a much shrewder job. If you're going to counter China, you want to have the Japanese and the South Koreans and the others be on good terms and not be annoyed at you because you're gratuitously offending them. And Trump
Calling the country shitholes.
Yes, exactly. But it was an important shift. But it wasn't, in Trump's case, it wasn't done out of principle because he has no principles. But the people around him were much more hard-nosed about China. But they were also responding to a shift in China's behavior. It wasn't that benign China was just happily trundling along and Trump came in and said, oh, we're going to thump them.